Hey everyone. So I'm going to talk about governance, which is, I think, something that was lost a little bit during the bear market, and hopefully we can put some more focus back onto it. So Synthetix has been around now for about 4 years, and over that time we've been working to try and develop our governance framework and improve how token holders control the protocol. And we've learned a lot, but we still have a lot of things we need to do. Okay, so I don't have notes, that's fine. The first thing is that when we started thinking about smart contracts, I say we as an industry, like the concept of smart contracts, we had this idea that smart contracts would be immutable. That you would deploy a set of smart contracts, they would have some function, and that function would sit there and do that thing forever, as long as the blockchain was running. And that if you needed to make a change, you would design that change and then deploy an entirely new set of smart contracts. There's a few problems with that, though, obviously. And we saw issues with a number of projects that taking this path. Augur, for example, going and designing a system over like 2 years in a vacuum, then deploying it and finding out that actually it didn't have product market fit. Ironically, Aragon also, given the topic of this talk, had a similar issue where they were trying to design a system in a vacuum, and they got to a point where they were covering so many cases that it was almost unworkable for any particular project to use it. And so we looked at this at the start of 2018 and said, okay, we're about to deploy a bunch of smart contracts. We don't know that these smart contracts are definitely going to do the thing that we want them to do. So how do we solve this problem? Because it's not reasonable for us to continue to upgrade every month and force everyone to migrate from one set of contracts to another over and over and over again. And this is back when we had the idea that we're maybe going to have like 5 or 6 upgrades before we solve the problem. I think we're up to like 200 or something. So had we chosen this path, it would have been pretty painful. But we decided to go with proxy contracts. And what the proxy contracts allowed us to do is basically have a set of contracts that could be upgraded or modified at any time, and those contracts would be controlled by a multisig. So this is great, right? We were able to make these upgrades. The issue is when you have a multisig that controls the contracts, that is effectively what your governance is. So we decided to do this. A bunch of other projects decided to do this. And that kind of led us through the end of 2018 and early 2019 into this like era of the multisig, right? Where basically every single DeFi protocol and almost every crypto protocol was governed by a multisig. And so, the industry came up with a few different ways of trying to like offset this. One of them was find some really high-profile signers. So, for example, I'm a signer on a bunch of multisigs. I can't even remember which ones at this point that I'm a signer on. And the issue with that is that it looks like you're adding security to the system, but you're creating a situation where you have people that are not really paying as much attention to the project as they maybe should, and you end up with this kind of consolidation of power. The other issue with the multisig as your governance framework is that token holders have zero recourse. And this is kind of like the dirty little secret of DeFi and crypto protocols, is that most of governance is signaling, right? It's not actually token holders making a change. It's token holders saying, we would like this change to happen, and then hopefully the multisig signers go and do it. The other problem with multisigs is once you assign them, they're actually really hard to remove people. So if you have like a 3 of 5 multisig, let's say, and 3 of the signers don't want to leave, you're stuck with them. There's no way to get rid of them. There's no way for token holders to step in and say, okay, remove these people or remove a specific person. The only way is to kind of fork the protocol, which obviously has its own issues. And so this is kind of the situation that we've been in for the last basically 2 years. And if you follow Chris Bleck, you probably heard a lot about this. He's not a huge fan of it. And I think as much as he's a bit hyperbolic, the reality is that like this is actually a problem, and it's a thing that we need to solve. So a few projects saw this problem and said, okay, let's solve it. Let's come up with a solution to this multisig problem. Compound was probably the most notable. So Compound built the Compound governance module, and the idea was that you would have a bunch of delegates that would have token holders put their voting weight behind them, and those delegates would then make a decision about an on-chain change to the protocol. The issue with this is that every single change needed to be coded. And so those code changes meant that there were probably like 10 people in the world that actually understood how to modify compound. And even sometimes the people who did, would make a change and there would be an issue with it, for example. So it just really centralized power for a change away from the community into like a small group of people, even though obviously it removed the multisig problem. Another project, Balancer, came up with an even better idea, which is called Snapshot. And what Snapshot did was accept the reality of multisigs and kind of put this very glossy veneer over it that said like, oh, look at our amazing governance framework. We've got this great signaling mechanism now where token holders can signal to the multisig signers what they want to do. And it actually made governance look like it was more robust. It looked like there was more input from token holders, but it didn't actually solve the problem. And in fact, it probably made the problem worse because it kind of lulled people into this false sense of security that we have good governance now. We've got Snapshot. Look at all the votes, and anyone can make a proposal, and all of this stuff. There's newer systems that have come out since then, but I think still none of these systems really kind of get to the heart of the problem. So let's take a step back with Synthetix. So when Synthetix launched in 2018, we were an open source software foundation. We had a number of entities, and we basically made a decision back in like 2019, 2020, that this was problematic. And it was problematic for a number of reasons, because we saw that there is going to be regulatory pressure applied to the industry. We could just tell that this was coming. And we knew that if you had entities, that was going to be an attack vector. And so what we decided to do was shut down all of our entities, and we basically transitioned everything to a pure DAO. And so we removed employees, everyone's a contributor, everyone's paid by the DAO. And this was another kind of controversial approach that we took back then. People still had this idea that like a foundation was a much more robust mechanism for governance. But we made the decision, we've pushed for it, and now I think a lot of projects have just decided to launch as pure DAOs rather than even starting with a foundation. So it has created a little bit of momentum for this idea of like a pure DAO. The other component of this was that we transitioned governance power from employees and contributors to a council. And I'll talk a little bit more about a council. So when you start thinking about how you're going to govern a protocol, you have a couple of options, right? There's a bit of a spectrum. On one end of the spectrum is direct democracy, and that's like Maker-style governance, if you're familiar with Maker. And then on the other side, you've got this like representative democracy where there's a small group of people that are voted in to then act on the behalf of token holders. And we decided that having this was going to be much more effective. And the main reason is that like direct democracy, you have a couple of issues. The first one is you're going to have large token holders. There's no way to avoid that, right? Andreessen has like 15% of the Maker supplier or something like that. And so you have a situation where someone makes a proposal, and you have a bunch of small token holders who all vote for or against that proposal, and then this huge whale comes and splashes in and says, actually, no, we're not going to do that. And so it has this chilling effect where people are like, why am I bothering to even vote when collectively all of the people in the Discord have less tokens than this single one VC? And there's no real way to kind of offset that in a direct democracy because it's one token, one vote. So we said, okay, let's do delegated democracy. But we'd seen other delegated systems, and one of the issues with those delegated systems is if they're unbounded, as in you can have as many delegates as you want, you end up with a kind of similar situation where you have a few delegates with a ton of power, and then like a long tail of delegates who have much less power. And that long tail of delegates can kind of get into a situation where they feel like they can't make a decision, and they sort of check out. And then the delegates with a lot of power end up with kind of de facto control. The other issue is that you have diffusion of responsibility. So even some of the large delegates who have a lot of voting power, they can also kind of lose sight of what's going on, and there's no way to really force them to act in the best interest of the protocol. The final reason that we decided to go with a council is whale resistance. So the way that we've set up our council is you have 8 members, and each wallet can only vote for 1 member. So, for example, Framework Ventures, right? They're one of the large token holders of SNX. They can only get one council member into the council out of 8. So they can have, maybe 1/8. Maybe if you split wallets, you could get a couple of council members. But it's very resistant to whales. And the idea was basically to ensure that everyone, whether you're a token holder that has 10 tokens or 10 million, has the ability to, influence the constituency of the council. So we got to this point, and we're like, okay, we've built this governance framework, we've got a council, we've got a bunch of sub-DAOs, we've got treasury management, we've got all of these systems, we've got improvement proposals, we've got a fairly robust governance framework, but we still have this issue at the core where it's totally discretionary based on what the multisig signers want to do. You can signal all day, but if the multisig signers don't want to do something, then it's not going to happen. And so we said, okay, we need to remove this kind of discretionary power from the center of the protocol and find a solution to it. And the solution that we designed is called V3GM. So it's the version 3 governance module. For obviously GM, you get the meme, right? But it was designed for a specific case. So the idea was, rather than designing for like a general case, every corner case or edge case, every possible DAO composition, let's just design a thing that's fully on-chain, that removes the need for multisig, and solves this one specific case of synthetic governance. And then we said, okay, now that we've designed this, let's make it modular so that smaller or larger DAOs can use it. And we can have a system that basically can scale to any DAO size, right? Because obviously the DAOs we have today, while they're big, they're much smaller than what DAOs will eventually get to, so this thing needs to be scalable. The final thing is it also needs to support treasury management. And this is one of the interesting things, I think, about the immutable path is even if, let's say you're Uniswap, and Uniswap is probably the best example of like immutable contracts, right? It's kind of the counterexample to all of this governance discussion. But even Uniswap needs to govern their treasury. And they found that, obviously it's a difficult thing to do. And, it's very challenging to kind of get consensus amongst a bunch of token holders about how the treasury should be managed. And so you've got all of these kind of points of friction where different constituents within the Uniswap community want different things to happen, and then sometimes things happen that no one wants, and there's a lot of infighting and it creates tension. And I think fundamentally the reason for that is that token holders feel like they don't have control. And so this is, I guess, the kind of outcomes that we're looking for from V3GM. Is the first thing is we want to remove trusted actors, right? We want to protect our treasuries, and we want to maintain agility. We don't want this to like ossify into a system where no change can be made and it's impossible to actually govern. Because at that point, you lose the benefits of this system is that as the market changes, as new technologies are invented, you can continue to iterate and adapt the protocol. If you can't do that, if everything kind of grinds to a halt, then this governance framework doesn't work. So ultimately, control must rest with token holders. Like that's where we need to get to. Today, control of almost every protocol rests with the multisig signers, and this is a huge problem. Like we need to solve this problem. Luckily, we've got a bear market, so we can actually take some time to sort some of this stuff out. And this is one of, I think, the primary things that we need to sort out before we get into the next bull market is make sure that we have robust governance frameworks that remove multisigs. And the way that V3GM does this is it basically has a hierarchy of control. Within each of the modules, you have, whether it's a council, whether it's delegates, whatever your governance chooses, you have that primary input, which is the main decision-making body. Because you don't want token holders to have to make every single decision. You want someone who's delegated to actually be thinking about this on a day-to-day basis and making the decisions. But if they make a bad decision, you want to be able to intercede and say, no, we're not going to do this. And so token holders need to be able to step in and say, this is not OK. And the way that we've basically done this is there's a hierarchy. So you have a council, and then maybe you have some secondary mechanism, and then the kind of final mechanism is token holders step in. And in a worst case scenario, they can also dissolve the council completely. And this is kind of the equivalent of removing multisig signers, right? The issue you have today is you can't remove multisig signers, but with V3GM, if the council goes rogue and attempts to do something and it's blocked, and the token holders collectively believe that they're not acting in good faith, they can basically be wiped out. and you can trigger a new election. You have new council members, and you can start the process again, and vote on the proposal again, and hopefully get a better outcome. So this is what we're building. We built probably 25% of it, the election module and a few other things. We're hoping that we're going to spin it out as its own project in the next 2 to 3 months, and then by early next year, it'll be open for people to use. So yeah, that's it. Thank you.